Chapter 24. Again, epic poetry must have as many kinds as tragedy. It must be simple, or complex, or ethical, or pathetic. The parts also, with the exception of song and spectacle, are the same, for it requires reversals of the situation, recognitions, and scenes of suffering. Moreover, the thoughts and the diction must be artistic. In all these respects, Homer is our earliest and sufficient model. Indeed, each of his poems has a twofold character. The Iliad is at once simple and pathetic, and the Odyssey complex, for recognition, scenes run through it, and at the same time ethical. Moreover, in diction and thought they are supreme. Epic poetry differs from tragedy in the scale on which it is constructed, and in its meter. As regards scale or length, we have already laid down an adequate limit. The beginning and the end must be capable of being brought within a single view. This condition will be satisfied by poems on a smaller scale than the old epics, and answering in length to the group of tragedies presented at a single sitting. Epic poetry has, however, a special capacity for enlarging its dimensions, and we can see the reason. In tragedy, we cannot imitate several lines of actions carried on at one and the same time. We must confine ourselves to the action on the stage and the part taken by the players. But in epic poetry, owing to the narrative form, many events simultaneously transacted can be presented, and these, if relevant to the subject, add mass and dignity to the poem. The epic has here an advantage, and one that conduces to grandeur of effect, to diverting the mind of the hearer and relieving the story with varying episodes. For sameness of incident soon produces satiety and makes tragedies fail on the stage. As for the meter, the heroic measure has proved its fitness by the test of experience. If a narrative poem in any other meter or in many meters were now composed, it would be found incongruous. For of all measures the heroic is the stateliest and the most massive, and hence it most readily admits rare words and metaphors, which is another point in which the narrative form of imitation stands alone. On the other hand, the iambic and the trochaic tetrameter are stirring measures, the latter being akin to dancing, the former expressive of action. Still more absurd would it be to mix together different meters, as was done by Curryman. Hence no one has ever composed a poem on a great scale in any other than heroic verse. Nature herself, as we have said, teaches the choice of the proper measure. Homer, admirable in all respects, has the special merit of being the only poet who rightly appreciates the part he should take himself. The poet should speak as little as possible in his own person, for it is not this that makes him an imitator. Other poets appear themselves upon the scene throughout, and imitate but little and rarely. Homer, after a few prefatory words, at once brings in a man, or woman, or other personage, none of them wanting in characteristic qualities, but each with a character of his own. The element of the wonderful is required in tragedy. The irrational, on which the wonderful depends for its chief effects, has wider scope in epic poetry, because there the person acting is not seen. Thus, the pursuit of Hector would be ludicrous if placed upon the stage, the Greeks standing still and not joining in the pursuit, and Achilles waving them back. But in the epic poem the absurdity passes unnoticed. Now the wonderful is pleasing, as may be inferred from the fact that everyone tells a story with some addition of his own, knowing that his hearers like it. It is Homer who has chiefly taught other poets the art of telling lies skillfully. The secret of it lies in a fallacy, for, assuming that if one thing is or becomes, a second is or becomes, men imagine that, if the second is, the first likewise is or becomes. But this is a false inference. Hence, where the first thing is untrue, it is quite unnecessary, provided the second be true, to add that the first is or has become. For the mind, knowing the second to be true, falsely infers the truth of the first. There is an example of this in the bath scene of the Odyssey. Accordingly, the poet should prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. The tragic plot must not be composed of irrational parts. Everything irrational should, if possible, be excluded, or, at all events, it should lie outside the action of the play, as, in the Oedipus, the hero's ignorance as to the manner of Laius' death, not within the drama, as in the Electra, the messenger's account of the Pythian games, or, as in the Missions, the man who has come from Tegia to Mysia and is still speechless. The plea that otherwise the plot would have been ruined is ridiculous. Such a plot should not in the first instance be constructed. But once the irrational has been introduced and an air of likelihood imparted to it, we must accept it in spite of the absurdity. Take even the irrational incidents in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is left upon the shore of Ithaca. How intolerable even these might have been would be apparent if an inferior poet were to treat the subject. As it is, the absurdity is veiled by the poetic charm with which the poet invests it. The diction should be elaborated in the pauses of the action, where there is no expression of character or thought. For, conversely, character and thought are merely obscured by a diction that is over-brilliant.
Summary and reflection for Chapter 24.
In section 24 of The Poetics, Aristotle discusses epic poetry, emphasizing its diversity and drawing comparisons with tragedy. Epic poetry, like tragedy, can take various forms: simple, complex, ethical, or pathetic. Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, serves as the supreme model, showcasing both simplicity and pathos in the former and complexity and ethics in the latter. Epic poetry differs from tragedy in scale and meter. Aristotle notes that while tragedy is confined to the actions on stage, epic poetry, owing to its narrative form, can simultaneously present many events. This capacity allows for mass and dignity, contributing to the grandeur of the poem. The heroic meter proves most fitting for epic poetry due to its stateliness, massiveness, and compatibility with rare words and metaphors. Regarding the element of the wonderful, Aristotle observes that it has a broader scope in epic poetry than in tragedy. The irrational, upon which the wonderful relies, is more acceptable in epic since the actors are not directly seen. Homer's skill in introducing the wonderful and teaching the art of telling skillful lies is commended. Aristotle advises poets to prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. The tragic plot must avoid irrational parts, excluding them if possible, or placing them outside the core action. The introduction of irrational elements must be handled with care to maintain an air of likelihood. The poet's role is discussed, emphasizing the importance of the poet minimizing their own persona and allowing characters to take the forefront. Homer is praised for his ability to bring in characters swiftly, each possessing distinct qualities. Finally, Aristotle touches on diction, suggesting that it should be elaborated in pauses of action to avoid overshadowing character and thought. An overly brilliant diction may obscure these elements.
Practical exercises.
Writers. Diverse epic narratives. Write short epic narratives, exploring the diversity mentioned by Aristotle: simple, complex, ethical, and pathetic. Heroic meter exploration. Experiment with writing narratives in various meters to explore their effects on the narrative's tone and grandeur. Composers. Musical epic composition. Compose an epic musical piece, capturing the grandeur and diversity found in epic poetry. Experimentation with meters. Create musical compositions using different meters to understand how they contribute to the stateliness and massiveness of the piece. Dancers. Choreographed epic elements. Choreograph a dance piece that mirrors the elements of an epic narrative, incorporating diverse movements for different characters and events. Expressive dance in different meters. Explore dance movements that convey the essence of epic narratives, experimenting with different meters to enhance expressiveness. Actors. Performance of epic scenes. Perform scenes from an epic narrative, paying attention to minimizing the poet's presence and allowing characters to shine. Character-centric monologues. Act out monologues focusing on characters from an epic, emphasizing their distinct qualities without overly showcasing the poet's voice. These exercises encourage artists to engage with Aristotle's insights on epic poetry, exploring its diverse forms, meter choices, and the art of introducing the wonderful while maintaining an air of likelihood.